The sun was a hammer and the land was its anvil. Out here, on the frayed edge of what men called civilization, mercy was a story told by fools to children. Ilara knew this. She knew it in the cracked leather of her gloves and the permanent squint of her eyes. Her ranch was a testament to endurance, a lonely island in a sea of dust and silence, and she, its solitary queen. But the silence she had so carefully cultivated was shattered that afternoon not by a sound, but by a sight. A stain of wrongness against the bleached canvas of the plains. Tied to her own fence post, the one marking the final boundary between her land and the world she'd left behind, was a boy. He was Comanche, no more than 10 winters old, his small frame limp under the brutal gaze of the sun. But it was the mark on the back of his hand, held taut by the rope, that stole the air from her lungs. It was a fresh brand, a crude teeth seared into his skin, the flesh around it an angry red welt. A thief's mark. Her mind, a place of ghosts and regrets, supplied the memory she fought daily to suppress, another small hand, unblemished, slipping from her own in a frantic moment of fire and chaos. This wasn't memory. This was a summons. She dismounted, her boots sinking into the parched earth, the rifle in her scabbard suddenly feeling heavier than sin. The boy's eyes, black and deep, fluttered open. They held no plea, only a defiant stillness that shamed the vultures circling high above. Ilara drew her knife. The blade, usually meant for skinning game or cutting rope, felt different in her hand now. It felt like a choice. With a single, decisive slice, she cut the rope, and the boy slumped forward into her arms. He weighed next to nothing, a bundle of resilient bones and simmering spirit. As she lifted him onto her horse, she didn't look back toward the town of Redemption Gulch. She didn't have to. She could feel its eyes on her, could feel the judgment of the man who had done this. Silas Kane. A man who owned the town, the law, and, he believed, the definition of justice itself. Carrying the branded boy across her threshold was not an act of charity. It was an act of war. Back inside the cool adobe walls of her small home, the world shrank to the size of a single room. The air was thick with the scent of dried herbs, leather, and the metallic tang of the boy's wound. Ilara worked with a quiet, practiced efficiency that belied the storm raging within her. She cleaned the burn with carbolic soap and water from her precious well, her touch gentle but firm. The boy never cried out. He watched her with an unnerving intensity, his gaze a silent ledger recording her every action. Was this kindness, or just a delay of a different cruelty? His stillness was a language she understood better than words. It spoke of a pain deeper than the seared flesh on his hand. It was the quiet of a soul that had seen the very worst of men and had decided to outlast it. As she wrapped the wound with clean linen, her own ghosts whispered to her. They showed her the face of her own son, lost to a fever the doctors in a town just like Redemption Gulch had been too busy or too indifferent to treat. She had buried him on a hill not unlike the one she could see from her window, and then she had buried herself out here. This silence she lived in wasn't peace, it was penance. The boy, as if sensing the shift in her, finally moved. He reached out with his good hand, not to her, but to a small leather pouch tied around his neck. He clutched it, a silent declaration that whatever was inside was his whole world. Ilara met his eyes, and for the first time, she offered a flicker of a smile. It was a rusty, unused thing, but it was real. In that moment, he was not a Comanche, not a thief, not a catalyst for a war she didn't want. He was just a child, and she was the only thing standing between him and the savagery of the world. The realization settled on her not as a burden, but as a purpose. A purpose she thought had died and been buried years ago. The quiet of the room was no longer empty. It was filled with a shared, unspoken understanding. They were two castaways on the same barren shore, and their survival was now lashed together. The dust kicked up first, a telltale plume on the horizon that signaled the arrival of trouble. Ilara had known he would come. Men like Silas Kane could not abide a loose thread in their tapestry of control. She stood on her porch, rifle held loosely at her side, the boy safely inside the house. Kane rode a fine black stallion, flanked by 2 deputies who wore their badges like apologies. Kane himself was a pillar of piety in a pressed black coat, his face a mask of benevolent authority that couldn't quite hide the rot beneath. He reined in, his gaze sweeping over her small, defiant homestead as if calculating its worth before burning it down. "Woman," he began, his voice smooth as oiled steel. "You are harboring a thief. A savage who stole from the good people of my town. Give him to me, and the law will take its course." Ilara's grip tightened on the rifle stock. The wood was familiar, solid. A truth in a world of lies. "He's just a boy, Cain. What could he have possibly stolen that was worth branding him like cattle?" Cain's smile was a bloodless slash. "He stole a map. A survey map detailing the new water rights for the entire valley. A document of immense value." He leaned forward in his saddle, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "He is a danger. His people are a danger. I am trying to build a future here, a place of order. You are standing in the way of progress." It was the lie that gave him away. Not the story of the map, but the word progress. She'd heard that word before. It was always the word used right before the graves were dug. "The only thing I see in my way, Cain, is you," she said, her voice flat and cold as a river stone. "This is my land. The boy is under my protection. Leave for a moment." Cain's mask slipped. A flash of pure, unadulterated fury crossed his face. One of the deputies shifted, his hand moving toward his pistol, but Cain raised a single, placating hand. "This is a mistake, Ilara. A grave one. The community will not support a woman who sides with savages against her own kind." He turned his horse, a picture of aggrieved righteousness. "When you are hungry, when you are alone, remember you chose this." The threat hung in the air long after they were gone, as toxic and persistent as the dust they had raised. After the dust from Cain's departure had settled back into the earth, a new kind of silence fell. It was heavier now, charged with the weight of her defiance. She went back inside to find the boy standing by the table, his small figure rigid with tension. He had heard it all. He met her gaze, and in his eyes, she saw not fear, but a desperate need to make her understand. He untied the leather pouch from his neck, his small fingers fumbling with the knot. He entered its contents onto the rough-hewn wood of her table. It wasn't a map. It was a collection of small, smooth stones, each one painted with a delicate, intricate symbol. And a single, tarnished silver locket. He pushed the locket toward her. With trembling hands, Ilara opened it. Inside, there was no portrait, only a tiny, folded piece of paper. It was brittle with age. She carefully unfolded it. It was a treaty, signed decades ago. A crudely drawn map on the back showed the very land Cain was now claiming, and it was marked as sovereign Comanche territory, with access to the winding creek, the valley's only reliable water source, guaranteed to them in perpetuity. The original treaty. The one Cain had told everyone was lost to a fire at the territorial office years ago. The boy then pointed out the window, toward the distant line of hills where the creek began, and then he made a gesture with his hands, like a wall being built. A dam. Cain wasn't just stealing water, he was choking the life from the boy's people, violating a sacred pact, and he was using a lie about a stolen survey map to cover his crime. The boy then pointed to his branded hand, and then to the signature at the bottom of the treaty, Thaddeus Cain. Silas Cain's father. The brand wasn't a mark for a thief. It was a message. It was Cain's brutal, ugly signature on a history he was trying to erase, branding the truth-bearer himself as a lie. Ilara looked from the treaty to the boy's earnest face, and the full, monstrous weight of Cain's evil settled upon her. This was never about a map. It was about memory. And Silas Cain was willing to burn anyone who remembered the truth. The town of Redemption Gulch closed ranks like a fist. Cain's words had been a poison seeded in fertile ground. When Ilara rode in for supplies, the general store owner suddenly had nothing to sell her. The blacksmith was too busy to reshoe her horse. Faces turned away. Doors closed softly in her path. The community she had kept at arm's length had now formally excommunicated her. She was a pariah, the woman who chose a savage over her own. The isolation she had once sought as a shield now became a weapon turned against her. Her small ranch, once a sanctuary, felt like a prison. The dust storms that rolled in that week seemed to mirror the turmoil in her soul, scouring the landscape, stripping it bare, leaving only the hard, unyielding truth of their situation. She and the boy were alone. But in that shared solitude, a strange and powerful bond began to form. They worked together in a silent rhythm. She would work the ranch, mending fences and tending to her few remaining cattle, while he would gather edible plants and track small game with a skill that defied his age. He taught her, through gestures and pictures drawn in the dirt, which roots were medicine and which were poison. She taught him how to sight down the barrel of her old rifle, his small hand surprisingly steady. They were no longer rescuer and victim. They were partners. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, painting the sky in hues of fire and regret, the boy did something new. He began to hum. It was a low, mournful tune, a song that sounded as old as the hills themselves. It was a song of his people, a song of the water they had lost, a song of resilience. Ilara sat on her porch, listening, the sound weaving itself into the fabric of the twilight. The melody was a balm on the raw wound of her own grief. She was not just protecting him anymore. He was, in his own quiet way, healing her. He was reminding her that survival wasn't just about breathing. It was about holding on to what is sacred, be it a treaty, a song, or the life of a single, innocent boy. The ghost that haunted Ilara had a name, Daniel. He was 7 years old, with her eyes and his father's laugh. The memory she kept locked away was of a winter night, a fever that burned like a prairie fire, and a town doctor who was too drunk to come. She'd held Daniel's hand, smaller than the Comanche boy's, and made him a promise. She'd promised him the morning. It was a promise the world had not allowed her to keep. After she buried him, next to his father who had been taken by a bullet 2 years prior, the silence of her life became unbearable. Every corner of her home, every path on her land, echoed with the ghosts of their laughter, their presence. So she had sold it all and fled, seeking a place so empty, so quiet, that the ghosts couldn't follow. She had found Redemption Gulch, or rather, the desolate land just outside it. She had mistaken numbness for peace, isolation for strength. She had promised herself she would never be responsible for another life, never make a promise she couldn't keep. That was her penance. Her self-imposed exile. But looking at the Comanche boy, whose name she learned was Nakona, which meant a wanderer, she saw the flaw in her logic. By saving him, she had broken her vow of detachment. By standing up to Cain, she had invited the world and all its dangers right back to her door. In protecting Nakona, she was staring into the face of her greatest failure. But this time was different. This wasn't a fever, a force of nature she was powerless against. This was a man. A greedy, cruel man whose evil was as plain and ugly as the brand on Nakona's hand. She could not promise Nakona the morning, not with Cain's shadow looming over them. But she could stand her ground. She could refuse to let this ghost have him too. This wasn't about redemption anymore. She didn't believe she deserved that. This was about consequence. It was about ensuring that this time, the price of injustice would be paid by the man who dealt it, not the child who suffered it. The memory of Daniel's hand slipping from hers no longer paralyzed her, it forged her will into steel. She would not fail another boy. Not again. Silas Cain was not a patient man. His power was built on swift, brutal examples. Ilara's continued defiance was more than an inconvenience, it was an infection of insolence that could spread. He needed to lance the boil, publicly and painfully. He rode into the center of Redemption Gulch, his face a mask of solemn duty. He gathered the townspeople in the dusty street, his voice ringing with false piety and carefully crafted fear. This woman, he declared, pointing vaguely in the direction of Ilara's ranch, has chosen to side with the very savages who threaten our homes, our children, our future. She harbors the thief who tried to steal the document ensuring our prosperity. She has turned her back on her own people. On us. He let the words hang in the air, letting fear do its work. Men who depended on his goodwill nodded grimly. Women clutched their children a little tighter. He was framing the narrative, turning Ilara from a protector into a traitor. The law must be served, Cain continued, his voice rising. And when the law is impeded by an outlaw, it must be enforced with a firm hand. For the safety of this community, for the future of Redemption Gulch, we will ride to her ranch at dawn. We will reclaim what was stolen, and we will see that justice is done. It was an invitation to a lynching, cloaked in the language of civic duty. He wasn't just going to remove her, he was going to make the town his accomplice. He wanted their hands to be as dirty as his own, their silence bought and paid for with shared guilt. As the crowd dispersed, their faces were a mixture of fear and grim resolve. A few, like the young deputy whose eyes never quite met Cain's, looked uneasy. But no one spoke out. No one questioned the verdict that had already been passed. In the dying light of day, Cain felt a supreme satisfaction. He was not just a man of power, he was a creator of reality. And in the reality he was building, Ilara and the Comanche boy were already gone. The dawn would simply be a formality. The first light of dawn was pale and grey, the color of ash. Ilara had not slept. She stood by the window, watching the horizon, the rifle cleaned and loaded beside her. She had given Nicona the treaty, tucking it back into his leather pouch. If they get past me, she had told him, her voice low and steady, you run. You run toward the eastern mountains and you do not look back. Show this to your people. It is your truth. The boy had simply nodded, his dark eyes holding a wisdom far beyond his years. He wasn't afraid. He was ready. The sound came as she knew it would, the muffled thunder of hooves, at least a dozen riders. It was Cain's posse. They fanned out in a semicircle, trapping the small ranch house against the rising bluffs behind it. The town was with them, a silent congregation of witnesses standing a safe distance away, their forms silhouetted against the growing light. They had come to watch the execution of hope. Cain trotted forward, alone, stopping just out of easy rifle range. Ilara! It is over. Send out the savage and we might show you mercy. Mercy! The word was a bitter joke. She raised the rifle, resting the barrel on the window frame. The iron sight felt cold and absolute against her cheek. She didn't answer him. Her silence was her reply. Let him wonder. Let him feel, for one brief moment, the icy grip of uncertainty. She was not aiming at Cain. She was watching his men, calculating, her mind a cold machine of angles and possibilities. She could likely take down 2, maybe 3, before they overwhelmed her. It wasn't a fight she could win, but it was a price she could extract. A price paid in blood for the life of one small boy. This was her final promise. A barricade of bone and will. She took a slow, steady breath, her finger tightening on the trigger. The world narrowed to the space between the front sight and the man who represented everything she had come to despise. This was it. The end of the line. The place where the running stopped. Just as Cain raised his hand to signal the charge, a new sound cut through the tense morning air. It was not a gunshot, not a cry. It was a low, resonant note that seemed to come from the earth itself, a sound that vibrated in the chest. Every head, including Cain's, snapped toward the eastern ridge. There, outlined against the brilliant fire of the rising sun, was a single rider. Then another. And another. They crested the hill not as a disorganized rabble, but as a disciplined line of war. 10. 20. 50 riders, their faces painted, their lances catching the morning light like slivers of captured sun. They moved with a silent, terrifying grace, fanning out along the ridge, a crescent moon of imminent judgment. At their center was a man who sat on his war pony with an air of absolute command, his face a mask of grim purpose. The townspeople, who had come for a spectacle, froze in abject terror. Cain's posse, so confident moments before, now looked like frightened boys playing at soldiers. Their bravado evaporated, replaced by the primal fear of a force they could not comprehend or control. Then, the door to Ilara's cabin creaked open. Nicona stepped out into the light. He ignored the posse, ignored Cain. His eyes were fixed on the warrior at the center of the line. A single, piercing cry left his lips, a call not of fear but of recognition. The lead warrior raised his lance in reply. It was his father, the war chief Black Hawk. Nakona ran, his small legs eating up the dusty ground, right through the middle of Kane's stunned men. He did not stop until he reached his father's horse. He looked up, and the words tumbled out of him in a torrent of Comanche, his small hand pointing, his branded flesh a testament. He pointed at the ranch house, at Ilara who now stood on the porch. Then he pointed directly at Silas Kane. The 50 warriors turned as one. 50 pairs of eyes, hard as obsidian, settled on the man who had built his kingdom on a lie. The balance of power had not just shifted. It had shattered. The air grew thick, heavy with the promise of violence. Black Hawk dismounted, his movements deliberate, imbued with a gravity that commanded the absolute attention of every person in the valley. He walked not toward Kane, but to Ilara. He stopped before her, his gaze taking in the rifle she still held, the defiant set of her jaw. He looked at the house that had sheltered his son. Then he gave a short, formal nod. It was a gesture of profound respect, an acknowledgement that transcended language. In that moment, the entire conflict was laid bare. This was not about a war between settlers and natives. It was a confrontation between courage and corruption, between honor and greed. Ilara lowered her rifle. Her fight was over. Now, justice would take its course. Black Hawk turned his gaze to Silas Kane, whose face had gone slack with disbelief and terror. The townspeople, freed from Kane's spell by a greater fear, now looked at him with new eyes. They saw him not as a leader, but as the architect of their potential doom. It was the young deputy who finally broke the spell of complicity. He spurred his horse forward, not with aggression, but with a look of dawning horror. "The boy is right," the deputy stammered, his voice cracking. "Kane told me the old treaty was burned. He showed me the new survey map himself. It was a forgery." The confession hung in the air, a final nail in Kane's coffin. The truth, once silenced and branded, was now free. Black Hawk listened, his expression unreadable. He could have unleashed his warriors. He could have washed the valley in blood and called it justice. Instead, he made a choice. He walked to Kane, who was now trembling, and simply took the reins of his horse. "He will not be judged by your law," Black Hawk said, his English clear and sharp. "He will be judged by the laws of the people whose trust he broke." He led Kane away, a prisoner. Not a single arrow was fired. It wasn't a massacre. It was a reckoning. As the warriors departed, taking Kane with them, Nakona ran back to Ilara one last time. He pressed the small, tarnished silver locket into her hand and then rejoined his father. Ilara stood alone on her porch, the rising sun warming her face, no longer a ghost in her own life, but a guardian of a fragile, hard-won peace. The story of redemption Gulch and the woman who stood her ground could end there. A simple tale of the West, of grit and consequence. But the dust of that valley, stirred by injustice and settled by courage, carries a lesson that time cannot erode. It speaks to the silence that so often surrounds a lie. A brand is not just seared onto skin, it is seared onto a community when good people look away. Every person in that town who knew Kane was a tyrant but said nothing was a part of his posse. They didn't hold the rope, but they allowed it to be tied. This story isn't just about a brave woman or a corrupt land baron. It's about the dangerous comfort of silence and the immense power of a single voice that dares to speak the truth, even when it trembles. How many times in our own lives do we see a wrong, big or small, and choose to walk by? We tell ourselves it's not our fight, that we shouldn't get involved, that someone else will handle it. But silence is a choice. It is an endorsement. Ilara's greatest act of bravery wasn't raising a rifle, it was opening her door. It was deciding that one boy's suffering was her business. Her redemption wasn't found in forgetting her past, but in refusing to let it repeat. So we have to ask ourselves, who are we in this story? Are we the silent town, hoping the trouble passes us by? Or are we the one person willing to cut the rope? The world is full of fence posts, and there is always someone tied to them. Your voice, your action, might just be the thing that summons a force for justice you never thought possible. If stories like this matter to you, if you believe in the power of standing for something, then subscribe to our channel. Share your own stories of courage in the comments below. Let's build a community that understands that the silence is where the ghosts live, but the action is where we find our soul.